So another improvised patch tutorial. Once again, I will build a patch from scratch, concentrating on one module. Today we have the quantizer from VCV. Yes, it's more or less a simple module, but many things will apply also to other quantizers, and we will look at a few ideas how you can use a quantizer. So this should be quite interesting. Again, I will try to keep this as beginner friendly as I can, but let's start with the basic functionality of this quantizer and basically what is a quantizer. So a quantizer will correct incoming voltage, and in the case of a quantizer, it will correct it into musical intervals. You can see we have here a sort of a keyboard layout. Right, we have the white keys and we have the black keys also here up, right? So this looks, if we use, for example, something like this, right? You can see here we have a keyboard and it looks more or less like a keyboard. So we can choose musical intervals and correct incoming voltage to these intervals, right? We can see this quite clearly with an LFO, for example. So if I send an LFO, right, this will be a sine wave LFO, basically a continuous signal that oscillates back and forth, right? But if I send this through the quantizer, and let's say that I select just the white keys, let's say, right, you can see this quantizer will be corrected, right? You can see it has sorts of steps. If I take this if I choose even less steps, right, you can see it's being quantized, it's being corrected into those steps. And again, in the case of the quantizer, these are musical intervals, right? So we can correct incoming voltage and create something so-called musical out of them. So for example, if we use a sequence, and I used the quantizer a few times in the last videos, but I just want to show you this now more in depth. Right, so for example, if I use just a sequence here, the sec3, right, the sec3 has basically range from -10 to +10, which means that we can have everything in between. Right? And these are also notes, but they are not quantized to so-called musical notes, to musical intervals. These are sorts of in between the notes, and I can show you this also. If I stop this for a second, I can show you this also with the tuner. Right, for example, this is one note. We don't have to listen to it. You can see it's more or less close to the note F, but not really. And let's see which step we are. Right, we have a continuous signal. We can just move in between and have also things between the notes. But if we want to quantize this, to have something that is quantized, it is corrected or fixed to musical intervals, we can use a quantizer. Right, so if I send this through the quantizer, if I send this voltage, and I have just, I'm gonna call it now the node C, but you will see in a second that it doesn't have to be the node C. But let's say that I have just the node C here on. Never mind where I go with this knob, we will just get the node C. Right, never mind, it will be quantized to the node C, different octaves, right? We can listen to this also. Right, different octaves, but it will always be corrected, it will always stay on the node C. If I activate, for example, two more notes, so E and G, which will give us the C major chord, triad. Right, it will always be corrected, it will always stay quantized and corrected to these notes. And of course, we can also listen to the sequence, how it runs. Let's go with 7 steps, I don't know why. Right, so now we have a sequence that will always output these 3 notes, in this case C, E, and G. Right, so this is the basic functionality of any quantizer, not just this quantizer, but any quantizer will work more or less the same. Some will let you choose individual notes like here, some will let you just choose the different scales. and will quantize to whole scales. But basically, this is how a quantizer will work. It will correct incoming voltage into musical intervals. Now, there is something to understand here, and this is what I wrote here. It's the shapes matter. The shapes are the ones that will decide the scale or the chords, minor, major, and so on and so forth. We saw this already, that this quantizer and many other quantizers also have the interface of a keyboard. Right, so we have here C, D, E, F, G, A, and B, and also C sharp, D sharp, F sharp, and so on and so forth. Just because we have a keyboard and just because I selected here the note C, doesn't mean that the oscillator will be tuned to the note C. Now it is tuned because in VCV Rack, as we've seen before, so in the previous videos, most oscillators are tuned to the note C4. So when I have C on the quantizer, it will correspond also to C on the oscillator. But if I detune the oscillator, right, we don't get the note C anymore. So the quantizer will not correct, will not fix, will not quantize the oscillator. It will fix or correct or quantize the incoming voltage. So if your oscillator is not tuned, for example, in this case to the note C, even though I have the note C selected on the quantizer, it doesn't mean that the oscillator will play the note C. And this is also the same in hardware. In hardware, you have to tune your oscillators all the time, which means that if you want C major, for example, you will have to tune your oscillator to C. But this is actually good news, because this means, and again, that's what I wrote there, the shapes matter. You don't have to memorize all the scales. For example, if today you want C major and tomorrow you want F sharp major, you don't have to memorize F sharp major. All you have to do is memorize the shape. And let me show you what I mean by that. So for example, if I just take, let me just take rescale here, what we used last time also. Let's see if I can find it quickly. Right, last video was about rescale, and we saw that we can send offset voltage, right? Let me just send this here. Right, so now I can offset the oscillator, right? So let's say that I want the C major chord, which will be C, E, and G. This is the shape here. These are the intervals, the distance between the notes, right? Now again, I have the oscillator tuned to C, but let's say that now I want F sharp major, the chord of F sharp major. I don't have to memorize the notes of the chord. I have here already a major chord set, right? The intervals, the distance between the notes. All I have to do is tune my oscillator to F sharp. Again, if I right click the frequency and I enter F and hashtag, right now the base frequency will be F sharp, and now I have the F sharp major chord. Right? And this is very good news because you don't have to memorize all the chords and all the scales. For example, if you want the C minor scale, this will be C, D, E flat, F, G, A flat, B flat. You don't have to memorize the notes. All you have to do is look at this shape and memorize this. You can also, in the right-click menu, just save presets. There are already lots and lots of presets already. For example, Locrian, Lydian, all the different modes. Major, minor, natural, pentatonic, major, all the different, right? So all you have to do is select one of them and then tune your oscillator to the note you want it to be, or the key you want it to be in, right? For example, if I want this to be B minor, all I have to do is enter B. Right, and now I have the B minor scale. Right, so the note C here on the quantizer is not anymore the note C on the oscillator. It's the base frequency, it's the key of the scale, which in this case is B. So this is very good news, because again, we don't have to memorize everything. I like to work, for example, with a pentatonic scale, which will look like this, the minor pentatonic, right? And all I have to do, if I want G minor pentatonic, I enter G on my oscillator, or tune it to G if you're in hardware or also in VCV Rack. And I have the G minor pentatonic scale. If I want to change this, I don't want G, I want D flat, which is C sharp, basically the same. Right, so all I have to do is tune my oscillator to the key that I want, and I don't have to memorize all the different scales. I don't have to memorize all the different modes. I don't have to memorize all the different chords. I just have to memorize shapes, or again, if you are in VCV Rack, maybe also in hardware, there are presets you can use or save. Just select the type of scale or chord or mode that I want, and then tune my oscillator to the note that I want to be in. So let's say that today we will be in D, right? So the oscillator will be tuned to D. No need for now for the tuner, no need for rescale. Let's go back to our sequence. Right, so now we have D, minor pentatonic. And pentatonic means basically a scale of 5 notes, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, pentatonic, whatever. So we have basically just 5 notes, and these 5 notes work with so many different combinations that it's easier like this to compose things. Right, so we have a 7-step sequence now. Let's work on this voice a bit before we continue. Again, we want to build a whole patch here, so I will use a VCA. And let's go again with the filter. And let's see, let's say let's go first to the filter, low pass filter, right? And let's also I will use also an envelope to control the VCA. Again, we send the oscillator through a filter and a VCA, and the VCA will control the amplitude, the volume of this voice, and we can use an envelope to shape the amplitude, to envelope the amplitude, the volume, right, of this. Right, the amplitude of this voice. And I'm going to use a second envelope here. I'm going to go classic subtractive synthesis voice, right? We're going to have another envelope here. Control Shift, I can take another cable, another copy of the gates. Right, I'm going to use the same gates and use this to control the filter. Right, and now let's use, for example, the second row here to control, let's say, the decay of this envelope. Right, something like this. And we can use the third row maybe. If I use the CV mix, I can mix signals, so I can mix the envelope, right, and send it back to the cutoff point. And now the attenuator here on the filter, I will open all the way because I have control now with the mixer. The CV mix is a great mixer for CV and audio as well, as we've seen in the last videos. Right, so now I can control the modulation depth with the first channel here. And then I can add or mix in the third row, right? I will open it all the way for now, and let's see what we can do here. Right, so we have a nice sequence here. And actually what I will do today is, instead of running the Sec3 with its own clock or with an external clock, what we'll do, we'll use another sequencer to drive it. So let's do this. Let's use, I will use a gate sequencer maybe from Count Modula, something small like the, let's see, there is the octet. Let me see just a second. If I can find something here. So let's go with the octet sequencer. No, let's go with the nibble sequencer, which is also small and has just one channel, right? So we have here the nibble sequencer. This sequencer needs an external clock. So for now, let's go with an LFO as our clock source. Again, a clock source doesn't have to be a dedicated module. It can be gates, triggers, and so on. So I'm going to use an LFO to drive the nibble sequencer. And now the nibble sequencer, instead of using a clock, we're going to use the nibble sequencer to drive the Sec3. Let's go a bit quicker. And now I can change here the steps. I can change here the gate sequences. Right, I would like to keep this as much as I can with the VCV modules, but we can also experiment with other modules just to create more interesting, not more interesting, but just to experiment with different modules and different ideas. More attack on the filter maybe, something like this. Right, so again, now instead of using a clock to drive the Sec3, I'm using a different sequencer. Now the Sec3 has 7 steps, the nibble sequencer, the gate sequencer has 16 steps, so there will always be some movement there, and they will always meet each other at different times, at different places in time, or points in time. Right, maybe a bit slower. Right, so we have a nice sequence here, a 7-step sequence. I'm just going to add some effects now, because without effects, nothing is worth anything. So let's go with a different delay today, okay? Let's go with a delay, or maybe last time we also used a different delay, with the delay from Surge XT. Right, and again, I'm going to use the same mixer I used last time from Venom, which is exactly like, not exactly, but it's very similar to the VCA mix from VCV, but in this case, it's stereo, so we can have also stereo voices. Right, so we have here a delay, right, and maybe, you know what, before this here, let's go also with a Galaxy reverb. Right, so we have delay and reverb for this voice. Right, and then the mix here. Right, in the case of this delay, we can also sync it with the clock. And in our case, the clock is the LFO. Right, and I can change here the notes. Not the notes, I can change the length of the note, sorry. Add some reverb. Right, so we have a nice sequence, right? Now, let me mute this for a second. No, let me leave this. Okay, and let's move on to the next point that I wanted to show you here. Let's see what is the time. Okay. So let's speak a bit about the offset. So we have here on the quantizer an offset option, right? We can offset the incoming signal before the quantizer. You can see it says pre-offset, right? Which means that basically if I stop this for a second, no, I have to run this because we're using a gate here. Right, so I can push the sequence up and down. Right, up to an octave. Up and down. Right, maybe I will mute this for a second and I will show you this with another voice, just because I want you really to understand this. Another VCO. Right, let's go here. Right, so now we have the VCO, and again I'm going to use rescale just to send offset. Right, so you can see now without any voltage, sending any voltage, right, 0 volts we have, it starts on the note C. As we've seen before, it doesn't have to be the note C, but in this case with this quantizer, With its interface, it's on the node C, but now I can offset it to start, for example, on the node G. Right, so 0 volts will be the node G, so we can offset it again up to an octave, and down up to an octave. Now the thing is here with this quantizer, we don't have a CV input for this. I mean, we can do this manually, but we don't have a CV input for this. But again, it says pre-offset, so it will offset the voltage before the quantizer. So all we have to do, right, and I can show you this, all we have to do is mix. Again, I'm going to use the CV mix this offset, and again, open it all the way so we have the same result, with another signal that will offset, right, that will offset it so it will start on a different note. So I can say, okay, I want to start on G. Right, so we have here another signal that we can use, right, to offset the sequence. Again, pre-quantizer, before the quantizer. So we can do this here also. Right, and you can see I wrote here also mixing voltage, because this is exactly what I wanted to show you, that you can mix voltage before the quantizer, and by that offset the sequence, offset your pitch information, again, up and down. So I'm going to use another sequencer here, and this one will be the ADDR sequencer, which is a simple 8-step sequencer from Bogo Audio. Now, if I'm going to use exactly the same clock and let the sequence exactly run at the same rate, we will get just basically the same result. And let me show you this. I'm going to use the same clock as I'm using for the SEC3, and I'm going also to set this to 7 steps. Right, so we have basically exactly 7 steps that are running exactly the same. And again, we need to mix this. Right, so I'm going to use the same sequence, again with the CV mix, open it all the way, now we have the same result. Just checking the levels here. Right, and then I'm going to mix in the ADDR sequencer. Right, and let's say that I want to offset it here and here. Right, we get a different sequence, but it's still always repetitive. Because again, we have the same clock and the same length. But what we can do, we can use a different clock. For example, if I use the first gate output here of the SEC3 as the clock for the ADDR, right, and we can go, let's say, with 4 steps just, and let's have the first and the second the same, and then they will be a bit transposed up. Right, so we have variation now in the sequence. Now another thing we can do in this case, and we already have a mixer here for the filter, right? We are mixing the envelope and the sequence, or another sequence. What we can do here is, for example, close the filter a bit. Right, but now I want that the higher notes, because they have a higher frequency and we're using a low pass filter, that will close the filter and will not let higher frequencies through. We can use the same pitch information to control also the filter, so higher notes will open the filter and will let the higher notes through, right? So now I'm going to mix in the pitch information from the quantizer, so we have also the offset and everything, and open this channel. Right, so now the higher the note, the more the filter will open, right? And it will let the higher notes also through, right? And we have some variation here. Okay, so this was our first voice. Again, we have offset, you can add variation, and create all sorts of different pitch effects, if you will, by offsetting the voltage before the quantizer. So in this case, in this quantizer, we don't have a CV input for the offset, but we can just mix signals before the quantizer and get the same result. Now there's another trick that is related to this, for adding variation with the quantizer. It's called the quantum trick, because it was invented by a guy named Dieter from the VCV community, and he invented this trick with a quantum quantizer. This is why it's called the quantum trick. The quantum quantizer has a transpose or offset CV input, but you can do this with other quantizers as well. So let's really have a look at this. Okay, so first of all, we need another quantizer, and let's go with another voice. Let's go with a VCO. I'm going to use a saw wave again, but in this case, I'm going to use a band pass filter. So if a low pass, we let low frequencies pass, and a high pass, we let high frequencies pass. A band pass, we let just a certain band of frequencies pass, and it will attenuate the low and the higher from this band. Right, so if we listen to this for a second. Right, we have this. If I add some resonance to this, you can hear this even better. Right? So now let's do this. Let me take this out for a second here. Let's use two sequencers. I'm going to use again the ADDR just because there are simple 8 steps. By default, they have 8 steps. They can be also longer, but just simple 8-step sequences. I'm going to use let's say ones here for the main sequence. Let's have 8 steps, let's say. So we have 7 steps and 8 steps. It will not sit exactly together. Another thing I would like to do, I would like to make sure that every time I open the patch or change something, I can always reset things so they will always start at the same position and I get more repetitive results. So for this, I can use the push module from VCV. Right, with this I can just push a button and it will output a trigger that I can use this trigger to reset all sorts of different things. For example, to reset the LFO, to reset the nibble sequencer, to reset the SEC3, to reset. Again, I'm holding Control and Shift so I can just take copies of the cable, right, to reset the ADDR here and to reset also the other ADDRs here. Right, so now with the click of a button, everything will always start at the same place and have more repetitive results if I open the patch, if I save it, if I want to load it somewhere else, and so on and so forth. Okay, let's go back to the quantum trick. So now what we will do, we will send this ADDR sequencer through the quantizer to this saw wave, right? And let's listen to it again and set a sequence. In the case of the ADDR sequencer in the right-click menu, we can change the range of the voltage. Again, we have volt per octave. 1 volt equals 1 octave. If we have, in this case, negative, positive 5, we have all in all 10 volts, which are 10 octaves. It's a bit too much. I will go with negative, positive 1, right? So I have 2 octaves, 2 volts to work with. Right, so this will be the sequence. And now instead of having this is cool, I like this song. Instead of having a whole scale, I'm just going to have a chord. Okay, so I'm going to have C, E flat, and G. And again, it's not really C, E flat, and G, but this will create the minor triad chord, right? And again, we are in D, if you remember from before, so all I have to do is set the frequency of the VCO to D, right-click it, enter D, right? And now we are quantizing to the D minor chord, right? So we have this sequence going, and now what I will do, I will add another quantizer. And this quantizer will have all the notes I'm going to allow this chord to be transposed into, right? So let's leave C, E flat, G, let's add F, right? And let's add B flat. So in this case, we went back again to the minor pentatonic. Again, you don't have to memorize these names, you don't have to memorize the notes. You have, in the case of this quantizer, the presets, or you just have to memorize the different shapes, the different intervals, the different spaces between the notes, right? And then just tune your oscillators to different notes. Right, so now what will happen here, I'm going to send this to the second quantizer. We're going to have the same results because we have the same notes here selected plus a few other ones. And then in between the quantizers, we are going to create the offset. So we're going to take this chord and offset it inside the scale. So we can transpose the chords but stay always inside a certain scale. And this is basically the quantum trick. Right now we have here another ADDR sequencer that I'm going to mix in. So again, we need a mixer. I will use the CV mix. Right, this will be the original sequence. Right, and now here in between I'm going to add also the ADDR. Right, again I'm going to open it, in this case all the way. Again in the right click menu, I'm going to set the range, let's say to, again, negative positive 1. And now listen to what happens when I start transposing this. Right, we have the same shape of the chord, right? We get the same chord, but we are transposing it inside the scale because we have two quantizers and we are transposing before the second quantizer, so we always stay inside the scale. Now again, also here I would like this to happen a bit less often. So a module I used in all the different videos before is the clock divider, so I can divide the clock, right, which is coming from the LFO. Also here I will use the reset, right, and reset everything. Right, so I can divide the clock by 2, by 3, by 4, by 5, whatever I want, right, and get slower clock. So let's say in this case divide it by 8, and this will clock the second ADDR. Before I do this, I'm going to set this again to 4 steps. Let's say we have one without transposition, one with, one without, and one with, right? So we have some variation, again divided by 8, again reset everything. Right, so again we transpose this chord inside the scale, and actually instead of divided by 8, let's use divided by 16. Divided by 8 will basically give us one cycle. Let's go with 2 cycles, so 8 steps, and then a change. Again, reset. Right, so also like this you can add variation. Again, you use one quantizer, a second quantizer, in between the quantizers you offset things. One is a chord, the other one is a scale, and you get more variation. Let's create a bit more variation here with this sound. So first of all, I'm going to add panning modulation with the fade module from VCV. The filter will go to the fade, and then we have 2 outputs as a stereo voice, left and right, and then with the fade we can crossfade between left and right. Right, something like this. And let's use, for example, I will use another module from Surge XT. It's called the Quad LFO, which basically gives us 4 LFOs, and they have different options. I have it by default set to smooth random. If you click one of the boxes here, you have the different shapes, right? You have sine, saw, triangle, sample and hold, which is not really sample and hold because you cannot really sample anything with it, but basically what it means, it's a stepped random, and you have random, which is smooth random, and you can also choose the polarity. So it's really a useful module here, and you can see this is, for example, the smooth random voltage, right? Each of the LFOs has a dedicated rate control, right? So you have smooth random voltage, and you have a few LFOs. So one of them, for example, can modulate the panning, right, a bit quicker, and another one can modulate the LFO. Right, again, also here I would like to add a delay, so I will add again the delay from Surge XT, and I will use also another reverb, another galaxy. Right, so let's do this. We go from the panning modulation to the delay. The panning will be before the delay, which is important. If you pan after the delay will also pan. You want to, in this case at least, I want to pan things before the delay, right? And then again, this will go to the filter, and again, we can sync the delay to our clock, right? In this case, the LFO. And another channel, right? We can make the delay a bit longer. Right, again add some reverb. Let's listen to this with the first voice. Right, so also like this you can transpose things, and again, don't forget, just because the quantizer has a keyboard and it says the note C or D or E, doesn't mean that this is the note. You can transpose things also just by tuning your oscillators, right? And you don't have to memorize all the scales. Just have to memorize a few shapes or the distances between the notes, the intervals. Right, and you can use a quantizer in all sorts of different ways. The next way I want to show you is with audio signals. As always in modular, it's always fun to use audio rate signals, so you can also process audio with a quantizer. And again, because it will quantize things to different steps, we basically get bit reduction. We lower the resolution of an incoming audio signal, which can be quite fun. So let's see if we can do this for a nice bass. Let's just start with the VCO, send this through the quantizer. I'm going to show you this also on the scope. Right, I'm going to activate all the notes on the quantizer for now. Right, so it will be quantized to all the intervals basically of this scale. Right, and I will use a triangle wave. And let me just mute everything else here. And let's listen to this. Right, and I will show you this also on the scope. So for now, maybe you can hear it if I connect it directly, for example. Right, you might be able already to hear and maybe also to see that it's already a bit more crunchy than usual. But the more notes I turn off, right, the more quantized, you can see the more quantized the triangle wave is, and we get more crunch. Again, we have sort of bit reduction. We lower the resolution of the triangle wave in this case. Right, so let's go again with D. In this case, I will go with D2. Right, so we can have this, we can mix in, let me get rid of this for a second, mix in another voice. I'm just thinking of doing this in stereo. Let's do this in stereo. Let's see if I will use the same stereo mixer. And I'm going to do this. I'm going to use another VCO. In this case, it will be D3, so an octave up, right? We have here D2, and here we have D3, and here we have D3, right? So it's an octave up. And what I'm going to do to turn this into something stereo, I think we did this also in the last video. I'm going to use two VCV delays as a sort of a chorus. I'm going to use here, for example, let's say the sine wave. Okay, let's use the sine wave and again, send this through a quantizer. So it's a bit more crunchy. Control Shift, I can take another copy of the cable. This will go to both delays. And then I'm going to use just the wet signal. So just like taking the mix all the way up, I just have here the wet output, right? Left and right. And I will mix in also the first sound that I had here with the triangle. And let's see how this sounds like. Oh, right. So this will be now just the signal through the delay. Right, I'm going to take the time down. And then use an LFO. I believe we did this in the last video. An LFO to both delay time CV inputs and open one to the right and one to the left. Make this a bit slower. Right, maybe a bit more feedback. Right, so we get this chorus flanger-like sound, and let's mix it in with this bass and with the other voices as well. Right, so this can be also quite interesting. Right, now let's say that I want also to control the pitch here on this for this bass voice, right? But I don't want all the notes. I just want a few notes. Right, so let's say I just want C, F, and G, which are not C, F, and G, because again we have it tuned to D, but those are the intervals that I want. Right, this will go to the volt per octave. Right, and all I need now is a sequencer, and you know what, I'm going to use the same sequencer here, the 4-step sequence that we are using to transpose. If I use it just as it is, let's see if it's too high for a bass voice. Right, it's a bit... Actually, it's quite okay. Now what we can do, I can add also glide or portamento with the process module. The process module will get its own video for sure, maybe this will be the next one. We have here slew, which will add glide between the notes. Instead of just jumping from one note to another, it will create a transition between the notes, right? So I'm going to send the pitch here after the quantizer through the slew. This. Another module from SurgeXT is the filter. In this case, this filter is stereo. So I'm going to use this stereo filter, add some resonance, take the gain a bit down because I'm going to add drive to make this a bit more crunchy. Right, and we have here more outputs from the quad LFO from before, again smooth random voltage. Right, and let's see what happens when I make this much slower. feedback. Right, this can be quite ambienty, but we can also make this quicker. Or bring it back like before, more or less. Right, so you can experiment with the clock also. And that was it for today. Again, this was the quantizer. It's a more or less simple module. There is also an option in the right-click menu to shift notes up and down. So this will also just take the shape and will keep the same shape or just transpose it. But again, as you've seen, if you tune your oscillator, you can also transpose things and you can also mix signals before the quantizer. Please go experiment with this quantizer and with the other quantizers. You can offset things, you can add variation to your pitch sequences, you can process audio, try process drums or something a bit more complex than just a sine wave like I did here or a triangle wave. Process it with the quantizer and see what happens. But that was it for today. Again, thank you again so much for watching. Cheers.